What would you like to see change in your life? And what is the biggest obstacle that you're facing now? I run 2 programs called Inner Knowing and Good Life Designed for serious individuals who are ready to take the next step in their personal and professional lives. I will personally be coaching a small group of individuals on tools and frameworks for creating an intuitive practice and for creating self-mastery in their life. As someone who's helped countless entrepreneurs open doors of possibility that they never thought existed, I've seen these strategies transform people's lives. The best part is that you'll 10x your output, unlock your creative genius. I'll work with you weekly to overcome your limiting beliefs. I'll teach you how to create clarity, processes, develop your intuition, and set a new framework on how to live your best life. And you'll get access to guided meditations that I have personally created that are not available anywhere else. We'll create a new self-concept that you can practice moving forward. This method is so effective that even if you don't have a lot of time or if you think you're not ready for a change, these frameworks and methodologies will still work for you. You can check out the link in the show notes to join the waiting list, and you can also check out what some of the previous clients had to say about our time together. It's first come, first serve, and I hope to see you there. Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Today's episode is with Sebastian Siegel, who is a British-American director, producer, screenwriter, and author, and his modes of storytelling range from filmmaking to contemporary art and psychology. Sebastian adapted, directed, and produced the feature film Grace and Grit, based on Ken Wilber's acclaimed book, and it is released everywhere internationally. Alex Grey says Sebastian Siegel is a dexterous and original director. His movie is transcendent storytelling at its best. And John Mackey says, like the book it's adapted from, this film is brilliant. Grace and Grit will shake you and maybe even awaken you in some way. This movie is a must-see, especially for anyone interested in love or consciousness. And I personally was incredibly moved by the film. I thought it was just incredibly well written, and it really evoked kind of a deeper kind of inquiry within me. So I encourage everyone here to watch the film. So welcome to the show, Sebastian.
It's a pleasure to be here, Yasmin.
So Sebastian, can you tell us, how does one create a good life?
It's a great question. And I think the first response we have to consider in that existential question is, what does good imply? And so many people quote Rumi as to this field, right? Beyond right and wrong, beyond good and bad. Yeah, I'll meet you there. This idea that good is a very human, conscious categorization of existence. So how does one create a good life? I think at first the requisite to that is having a deep sense of knowing what's meaningful and what's fulfilling to us. And so then therefore the requisite to that is, what is it intuitively that is speaking through us that informs us of why we're here and what we're doing in this life? So when we're a kid, a good life might just be a simple, time in the arms of our mother or our father or our friends, or laughter. And then as we become more mature and complex, it might be bringing things into the world from this space within us that feels that it needs to come out into existence, both for our own satisfaction, for our own fulfillment, for our own sense of meaning and belonging, and also as a means to connect with something that's beyond us so that we might become something that is beyond us, i.e. the extrapolation of consciousness, the expansion of existence, right? It's always changing. It's always growing. Like, for instance, there is no such thing as enlightened, right? It's only enlightening. And this term, even enlightened, suggests that that's the end of the expanse of consciousness. So in that process, I think, what is a good life? I would think of it as destiny as a hand reaching out to another hand. And that one hand is the hand of God, if you will, or spirit, or consciousness. And the other hand is our own actions, our own thoughts, our own courage to show up in the world. right? As Anais Nin would say, life expands or contracts based on our courage, right? And how we show up. And in that same way, creating a good life is listening to this deep inner voice, not this impulse of what we want right now, or this impulse that would drive us away from the things that we're afraid of, either because they're too daunting or because they're too grand and tremendous and they scare us because we don't know if we can carry those things, or that if we can live those life, or that if we deserve that life. And so it's really listening to this deep intuition, deep within the soul, deep inside, and taking action and taking courage and reaching out. And then the hand of destiny is reaching back to us all the time. And it's always moving. Its fingers are trying to touch our own fingers. And so I would say that living a good life is constantly listening to that voice deep within. And to ground that in a daily practice, it might be a meditative practice. It might be a journaling. It might be a sharing with a friend or a lover or a family person. It might be a religious practice of going to church or temple or, whatever the ritual is, but something consistent that allows us to look within so that we might grow beyond. I would say that that is the requisite for living a good life, creating a good life.
So, I want to double click on something you mentioned about the inner voice versus impulse and intuition. And these are topics I think a lot of people are really interested in. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your intuition means to you and also how you can access it? Because I think a lot of people, you mentioned a couple examples, but I think a lot of people don't really know where to start and also how to discern their intuition versus like a trauma response or a fear-based kind of, or even a projection. So I'm curious, how do you navigate that?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. The first step, I think, is getting out of our own way and deciphering, right? And in so many ways, and let me take a short tangent there, just to say that discipline is freedom in so many ways, right? That, putting off what we want now for what we really want, et cetera, that looking at this life that it's important to fantasize about life, to daydream about life. How do we see ourselves living? How do we want to engage? How do we want to show up, right? And in such a fantasy, it might look something like, I'm totally in love and committed to an individual. Somebody is in love and committed to me. We laugh. We circumnavigate, explorations of challenges within one another and between one another, and we overcome those things together. Through that, we cultivate artifacts, whether it's, we manifest things in the world, such as offspring that might be children or vocations or poetry or, laughter or joy or building things in the community around us. And so listening to our intuition is a question of getting out of our own way to say, well, what do I want just here and now? And yet, what is it that's really driving the ship? In other words, there's something within me, within us, that is speaking through us all the time, right? There's something that's guiding us. And I think that it's right on point, right? The desire to try to interpret where that thing comes from and what that is, what that energy is, because we're so guided by subconscious choices that are trauma responses, right? That are impulsive, right? Fears, abandonment, overwhelmment. And so one of the practices of listening might be, listening, in other words, to that voice deep within, to that intuition, might be, in very simple terms, waking up in the morning and just jotting down our dreams or sharing them, right? It might be free writing just explosively with a pen, pencil, paper, and writing, just letting it out, not letting the pen stop, right? This very basic exercise, allowing something out to uncover something that's deep within. In the Freudian term, to take what's in the shadow and bring it into the light, to create a more cohesive identity. And lucid dreaming has become something that's been very interesting to me my whole life, and something that I've developed in California to do one lucid dreaming immersion experience for small groups, one a month, to be able to uncover what's going on deep down inside and how do I let that thing up, right? What is it that I'm excited by inside of myself and both afraid of inside of myself? And it comes through in moments, sometimes in our dreams, sometimes in our creative writing, sometimes when we are, really at a point of distraught brokenness, if you will, or elation and total joy. And I think that a lot of these human qualities that we have of passion, of eros, will spark the difficulties in trying to attain some sort of union, will spark a conflict by which we have to vocalize those things because we're not at ease unless we do. Whereas prior to that vocalization, we might be at ease ignoring it. Right? So in other words, the intuition is always something that is hiding because it's something that breaks us, that shatters us. And when I say breaks and shatters, I mean it in the most profound way in terms of a spiritual practice, right? That spirituality is not a warm hug, right? It's an earthquake because the ego has to break to be reborn to a stronger new sense of identity. And so the function of the ego is to preserve itself. And yet it has to be broken to preserve at a deeper, more complex level, right? The ego is fantastic, right? But it has to consistently be broken and consistently be rebuilt with a new form of identity. And we've gone through that so many times in basic rites of passage, right? From going to first grade to going through puberty to falling in love to getting heartbroken, et cetera, right? New identifications, self-identifications. So I would say that the deep intuition in the very Joseph Campbell-esque way is if you're walking through the forest and you look down the side and you see all these dark trees and you see a pathway and you're with someone else and they say, no, there's no pathway there, but you see a pathway. That's your pathway. It's daunting, it's intimidating, and yet it's calling you. It's spectacular. It might bring you to your end, but that end is also your own becoming, right? Our own doing. And so I think in that way, it's magical at first, and then it's mystical when it's heeded and when it's dedicated to. And finding that voice is a deep listening within that we have to search for, that doesn't come from just one place. It shows up in our lives in a number of different ways. Sometimes it's in the eye contact of a stranger. Sometimes it's right in our dreams. Yeah, and sometimes it's in deep tears. And sometimes it's watching a play or listening to music and having this powerful laughter that rocks us to the core, that we feel elated and that draws tears, that we're excited about life. And I think that at those moments, that's when we must listen and pay attention and acknowledge that by remarking it. Yeah, by responding to it. Yeah, with the people that we're around.
So you said a lot of things. So I want to actually kind of go back to a couple of things. Lucid dreaming is a topic, obviously, that you spend a lot of time thinking about, and you have this beautiful also workshop where you take people into a kind of lucid dreaming environment. What do you think happens when we're lucid dreaming, and why is that an important vehicle for spiritual transformation from your perspective?
We're always dreaming, and we shut out those dreams, and we have this clear, conscious, waking state as a function of evolutionary survival, right? In other words, I dream that I jump off a cliff and I fly through the air and I walk through the fire, right? And then the ones who then jump off a cliff and walk through the fire die. And so evolutionarily, we start to differentiate between our dreams and our waking state, right? And so we peripheralize those for the conscious mind to be able to navigate in the world. I'll meet you here at this time and do this thing, right? That we have this dream state then when we're asleep that comes to the forefront when the conscious mind then is at ease and allows those things to come up. And so there are aspects in our dreams that are informing us all the time of content that's happening deep inside, right? Our shadow, our gut, things that, and as they come up archetypally, and Jung talks about the archetypes, that we're born with different archetypes that are recognizable to us immediately. And Joseph Campbell, who I met when I was a boy at a moonrise in Hawaii, speaks a lot about that, the myth showing up in our dreams. And I think that the power of, or the qualities and the significance and the potential assets that are discovered in our dreams can be something as a means to look at ourselves and what exists beyond ourselves, right? And so if I want to ground that simply, I might say, you think about, your first dream as a kid, one of your early dreams, right? And you remember that as if it was an instant ago, right? You can hold it right there. And your sense of identity, your sense of self, it's still this I-ness, this I am, that today you are very different from that person. And yet that I amness is the exact same, right? You do different things, you look different, you engage differently with the world, you have different desires and hopes, and yet this sense of I am is the same. And so if we take that back even before that time of the first dream you remember, let's say 7 years old or 10 years old or 5 years old or 3 years old or 2 years old or perhaps in the womb, how far back can you go? Let's say it's before the womb, right? Let's say it's in the eye contact of your own parents, of two people that meet, and that spark, right? In other words, the memory is accessible to you as a child, your own dream, right? Or your own first waking memory, let's say. And so then therefore you have access to being in the birth canal. You have access to being in the womb. It's just not conscious, right? It's precognitive, right? It's transrational. And so I think that when we pay attention to the things that are going on in our lives, let's say, for example, to make a sort of easy correlation with that, we might grow up, listening to some sort of music that excites us because it's beautiful music, right? Like Marvin Gaye, he's got this beautiful voice and a beautiful rhythm. And then the first time we're heartbroken, we hear Marvin Gaye and it takes on a whole nother meaning, right? That the music rocks us in a different way because the words mean something. And paying attention, so then therefore, to what's going on in our dreams is something that says, number one, what's going on personally for me in this experience of life? But number two, what's going on in life in general? There are messages all around, right? In the eye of the stranger, when we catch eye contact and we take a breath and we're patient and we really make eye contact with those around us, the amount of nonverbal communication that's occurring is profound and spectacular and beautiful, right? And then therefore also in our dreams, there's something going on here that has evolved for millions, for billions of years, that is gorgeous, just like looking out into space and looking at the supernova. And so to acknowledge that, I think is important in terms of participating in the beauty of this miracle. So it's something that I have valued very much since I was a kid. And I think that if we're not paying attention to the most simple and fundamental things and cultivating the well of those aspects of being, then that's dangerous, right? Because, and I'll put a button on it by saying it's dangerous, particularly now with the advancements of AI, that we've got to look at things and be able to differentiate the difference between an optic, something that just appears beautiful, that is cultivated by a machine, or something that is really listening to the heart, that is listening to billions of years of evolution and say, this voice comes from within and beyond. It's not an optic, but it comes from a well that's deep inside. Yeah, and if I'm going to be alive, well, I might as well pay attention to that. So I think that paying attention to dreams and pay attention then to the waking dream, the subtlety all around us, like in the eye contact of any stranger, is paying attention to the sort of mystical miracle that life is.
So I want to actually switch gears because I want to talk a little bit about the movie. But before we get into the movie, because I think there's a lot to say about the movie, the Grace and Grit, I want to talk a little bit about shadow work. I know that's something that you have been alluding to in the conversation quite a bit. And I think, for me at least, like the question I have about, shadow work, especially, in comparison to the spiritual path, is that it feels like a lot of people don't actually understand that those two things feel very separate. And I say this because we recently had Connie Zweig on the show, who wrote the book Romancing the Shadow. And I was thinking a lot about, the idea of shadow, because it feels like there's so many people who are on this spiritual path of inquiry. They're doing the work, they're lucid dreaming, they're tracking their dreams, they're meditating, they're listening to their inner voice. And, yet you have things like, people like Osho and John of God and priests, kind of doing things to young boys. And so clearly there's like a disconnect between the shadow, or, the personality, and also the spiritual path. So I'm curious, especially since you've done a lot of work with couples, with people. I'm curious, what things have come up for you when uncovering the shadow, and also in the work of integrating our shadows. So I think like what would be helpful for our audience is perhaps like your perspective on a way that people can think about integrating their own shadow, or even understanding their own shadow, while, thinking about their spiritual path.
Mm-hmm. James Hollis is the foremost Jungian psychologist, I think, in the world alive today. And he's become a dear friend and a mentor for me in a lot of ways. And in the Jungian way, Hollis writes so much about, that we wake every day and we're all faced with these two challenges of abandonment and overwhelmment. Right? That will the world ignore us and let us go? And will the world be too much for us? That we don't have a place in it, right? And that we have to confront that with our own sense of courage and our own sense of action and our own sense of engagement and our own sense of being and our own sense of doing. And so the shadow inside of us, what are these things inside of us that we don't like to look at because it's unpleasant, or because we're daunted, because we're afraid that, we don't want to sign up for something because we might fail, whether that's a love relationship or a vocation, right? That we don't want to go somewhere because we are afraid we might be ignored or won't be accepted in a way that we want to be seen. And so the value of looking at that deep inside is to first say, this has been happening for billions of years and perhaps outside of the stream of time. And so to have total faith in it, right? So for me to take it on in the very first, most simple way. And you brought up Osho. And I think that one of the powers in his work and one of the reasons he captivates the minds of so many people is because, if nothing else, he has an amazing sense of humor, right? And many incredible writers of spirituality and transcendence do, right? Whether it's Ken Wilber or Adida or Osho or Ramana Maharshi. Ramana Maharshi is not known for his sense of humor, but he's romantic, right, in his writing, and a huge influence on me. But then definitely the writers of Zen have incredible sense of humor, right? Shunryu Suzuki, D.T. Suzuki, etc. But point being is that to not get overwhelmed, right, by what it is to be human, to look inside the shadow and say, hey, it's okay. Like, this all ends in death, right? And death is not so bad. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful rite of passage that I don't remember what happens after death, just like I don't remember really what happened before birth. I can intuit it, but I don't really remember it. So now here we are today, and I'm 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or whatever the thing is. And what is it that I want to look at that's deep inside of me that is limiting me in some way to love deeper, to breathe more deeply, to be more excited about participating in life? And it is in that sort of Freudian and that sort of, Jungian sense that Hollis writes about this fear of abandonment, this fear of overwhelmment. So the requisites then are to say, okay, I'm going to look inside because I want to take some of this salt or some of this honey. In other words, the thing that hurts and bothers the wounds, or the thing that excites me and is maybe too exciting for me. And I want to combine those things to create one more cohesive identity, right? If we're making a cake and there's not enough salt in it, it's not quite right. We add a little salt and all of a sudden it juxtaposed with the honey makes the cake sweeter. And such is that in life. And I think that that's the methodology that I would use in practice at my office in Santa Monica with couples or individuals, high functioning individuals in general, to be able to say, let's look inside at what's going on, right? And let's take some of that salt and bring it in to our life in a way to say, you know what? the world's not going to abandon me, not because I trust it, but because God or Spirit has carried us this far. In other words, to personalize it, it's carried you, it's carried me, it's carried us this far. Why would it abandon you now? Right? In the very simple terms, in the very simple, obvious, fundamental ways that life goes on, right? Even if we look around the world and we think, oh my God, what's happening in the oceans, what's happening in the world, what's happening with morality, it still goes on. And in 1,000 years and in 100,000 years and in 1,000,000 years, it'll still be going on. That's what gives us the sense of humor about it. That's why these great authors and great writers have such a deep sense of humor, because we take the personalization out of it. So to put a button on that, I think that looking into the shadow can be scary work sometimes for someone saying, well, I had this traumatic experience as a kid. And I think the first step is saying, well, it's okay. Like, that's okay. It's not personalized. It's part of the salt and the honey in life. Let's look at it. Let's uncover it. And let's use it as a powerful, powerful force, right, within us. You know, and I'll end on that one by saying that any great artwork that we love, right, whether it's a painting or a movie or a song or a poem or a book, it always brings us to tears in some way, right? And it elates us in others. And so the cultivation of that in our own personality, within our own identity is important. And I would say that the shadow work is part of that cultivation. It makes us more complex, more beautiful beings, more manifestly, more manifest. It helps us manifest more beauty within ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I've noticed that when people can't accept their own shadow, they can't accept the shadows of others. And I think, like you said, it's what gives kind of people that complexity and that beauty. And you also spoke about having a sense of humor. I think that's so underestimated on the spiritual path, because I really truly believe that is like one of the highest kind of spiritual access points, right? Is our sense of humor, of just our mortality and the shortness of life. And, my dad actually escaped the regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And he's got such an incredible sense of humor. And I used to always I was very moved by how funny he was, growing up. And I think also just he didn't spend so much time wallowing in any kind of pity. And there was just such a great acceptance of life. And I say this story because I think a lot of us, spend a lot of time really stuck in our shadows or in the difficulties of life, rather than accepting it, honoring it, doing the work, but also moving on and having that lightness and that sense of humor, as we walk through life. So I just wanted to share that.
I appreciate enormously what you're saying, and particularly with your father's journey, and also I think that the incorporation of the shadow does the acknowledgement of it in ourselves, right, and the re-acknowledgement, right, because it's never complete; it's ongoing. We have to keep cultivating what we're afraid of or what we're daunted by, and bring it. The more we bring it forward, right, then of course the more forgiving we become, and the better the sense of humor gets. And I think it's fast. Western culture is fast to judge what's going on in other countries and in other cultures, and it doesn't have a broad popular appreciation for the process of evolution over time. Right? In other words, we go back 2,000 years. Life was pretty rough back then, but not for them back then. It was rough for them back then from our viewpoint now. Right. But back then it was the same thing to them as it was today. Right. For us, we go back, 1,000 years, we go back 2,000 years, go back further. So to look around the world and to be judgmental of what's going on in other cultures is important. To drive, to be vocal about, rights, to be vocal about, humanity, to be vocal about, because there's injustices going on in every level, right? Whether it's human, whether it's sentience, just basic sentience, animals, the way animals are treated. We're always doing something, right, that could be done more beautifully in our own lives personally, right? Like what we're wearing, what we're doing, how we're speaking with people who we're acknowledging, who we're ignoring, whether we're aware of it or not, what we're eating, what the way we're treating animals, people around us, is just as important as our vocality around things internationally. because it's going to go on, right? And it ends in death. And it's like, all right, so what? Like, let's get over ourselves. Like, are we that important? Like, it's okay to die. Like, when we start looking at death as this beautiful thing, then it's like, okay, all right, this is pretty fun. This is a pretty good time here. And so I think that those things go hand in hand. In other words, to say, look, I want to drive consciousness evolution, like the courage, right, that it takes your father to persevere through something so intense. And yet to have a sense of humor means that he has now this perspective that, okay, like I'm not the first one who did this. Many people will come after me, and many people came before me. And this is part of what evolution is. In other words, the process of evolving is what we're signed up for. There's not a finality of place where it's all good, right? That final place is non-duality, right? And then after that, what happens? Duality again, right? That then we're born into something so that we can feel intimacy, so that we can look at one another. In other words, God comes into existence through us so that it can have awareness. Because as Ken Wilber would say, it's more fun not to have dinner alone, right? It's more fun to share the rainbow with someone. But the price of sharing that rainbow with someone is discomfort and pain and all these other things that come with it, right? So we have to have a sense of humor about those things.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A common theme that has come, has been spoken about through this conversation is death and our mortality. And I think that's really important for the folks listening. I think especially in the West, we sort of don't really remember death. We're always so surprised when it happens. And I think we also don't really like to talk about it publicly. It's just something that is sort of pushed to the side in culture, at least in the West. And I think that's been really difficult, I think, for us to recognize our mortality, but also, look at life in a sacred way, right? Because those two things kind of need to happen at the same time. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think it's, it's interesting. Even during COVID, it felt like we just never really were able to process the idea of death. It just felt like it was still hidden underneath the surface. So
if there's something that's at the core of my work, right, and I work in consciousness in 3 realms, in writing, producing, directing movies, and in psychology and books, and in immersive meditative experiences, it's really about the celebration of death and the process of that. And when I say the celebration of it, I mean transcendence, right? I mean that as a boy, my interest in the Hindu iconography, these different gods and how they were all avatars of one another, I think retrospectively related something to me that said, okay, this thing goes on and on and on. So like death isn't an end point, or a beginning point. It's sort of both. And that if we can celebrate that, just like the sunrise and the sundown, that if you're outside the earth, there's no sunrise and no sundown. It's only our perspective. And so it's the same thing with death, right? If you're outside of our own personal identity, there's no death. It's just going on and on and on. But when we're inside of ourselves, we see death and birth behind us, ahead of us, just like we see the sunrise up and sunset behind us, ahead of us. And having that perspective is really at the core of everything I touch. So as you know, you've been to the lucid dreaming experience, I facilitate, and I use a number of different modalities, right? Orchestra music, subliminal sounds, live story, binaurals. And I do the same thing in psychology. I do the same thing as a filmmaker, trying to push these limits for audiences to sort of touch something that is deep within and far beyond. And that's my interest really as a storyteller in these capacities. In Grace and Grit, the book, Ken Wilber's book that I adapted to screen, the book rocked me in such a way, right, that it's so heart-wrenching, and yet it's uplifting and beautiful in some wild way. And I found that when I was reading the reviews about it all around the world, that other people felt like that, right? And so I try to do this, in other words, to create a sort of spiritual practice in psychology and in lucid dreaming and in film. I want to invite people in and then unsettle people a little bit so we can stir things up, to then have a really big party and total elation at the end of it, right? Because we feel satisfied when we uncover something deep inside. We don't feel satisfied when we can have whatever we want, right? I mean, we look around the world and you see people born with everything, have everything, die with everything. That's a boring life. Nobody wants to watch that movie, right? Everybody wants to watch Braveheart or, where we uncover, where we take the risk, a Titanic, whatever the thing is, that we take a risk and we go beyond ourselves and we love what can't be loved about ourselves and about others, that we do what can't be done. Yeah. But we don't want that on ourselves when the door's there for us. So we must invite that thing in and get excited about it and support that in one another, in the people around us. So death is at the center of everything that I do, in a very celebratory and mystical and romantic way.
I love that. And I think, things seem to be much more memorable when there's a bit of fear involved. And risk involved, like you mentioned, right? I always remember those moments more, the highlights of my life. So I want to make sure we talk about Grace and Grit. I recently watched the movie. I loved it. I think I cried multiple times. I'm not a big crier, honestly. And so it just moved me, and I really didn't know what to expect, to be honest. I did not read the book before I watched the film, and so I didn't have a lot of context around the romance between Ken Wilber and his late wife, but it was gut-wrenching. It really, really rocked me to my core, and I think there was like a remembrance of what could be too. Can you speak about the film, like what creating the film meant to you, why you decided to make this particular film after reading the book, and so many other follow-up questions, but we'll start there.
Thank you so much. I am a voracious reader and was reading everybody in psychology and philosophy and spirituality. And then I came across Ken Wilber X number of years ago, and he just blew my mind. Like, this is, somebody who all the most brilliant people alive today have read and are reading. And so many brilliant authors are popular because you can pick up their books and without having read anything else, the voice speaks to you and it's easy to interpret. And so that's the value of so many incredible authors today, right? Ken Wilber doesn't speak to a broad pop audience. So the requisite to reading his books is that somebody's already had to read 10 or 100 other books. So, and he's not interested in speaking to a broad pop audience, right? He's interested in pushing the edges of consciousness. And then when I found out, wow, all the most brilliant people alive today talk about him as being one of the most brilliant people perhaps that ever lived, right? From Deepak and Tony Robbins and Marianne Williamson and every psychologist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when I discovered his work, I started reading all his books, and I just fell madly in love. And he had this radical sense of humor, and he was so brilliant on every page. It's just, after getting comfortable with the vernacular, it's so unbelievable. Like, the guy's mind is extraordinary, right? And so then Grace, and he's the most widely read and translated scholastic author in America. About 30 books in 30 years. And, when I fell in love with his work, I found that it was part of my own spiritual practice, my cognitive practice, but also my own spiritual practice of listening to something deep within, right? That he was writing stuff that was so romantic and so beautiful and so extraordinary, from every level of religion and science and spirituality and meditation. And it was just mind-blowing. And Grace and Grit, and I always wanted to meet him, and he's very hard to get in touch with, this guy, this Ken Wilber guy, yeah. And before him, I was in love with Alan Watts, and I thought, well, I'd read every book that Alan Watts ever wrote, and if he was alive today, I'd go, sleep on the dock in Sausalito, California, and say, look, I'll clean barnacles from your boat, but I'm going to learn something from you by spending time with you. But he's dead. I can't do that. So now I discover Ken Wilber, and I've got this like mad love affair with this guy's mind, but he's alive, and I'm going to get in touch with him as he's impossible to get in touch with. Anyways, eventually I was invited to do a radio show. We got there in Colorado, and I was writing stuff on the Huffington Post. And it was obvious that I was influenced by Ken Wilber, and they invited me out there, and he and I met. We were simpatico, and I read Grace and Grit late in my reading of his, and I had no sense of me being involved in it as a movie, but I just thought it just blew me away, like so many other people around the world. And then it really chose me. There was something deep within that I was listening to, my intuition, and I said, I have to be the one to tell this story as a movie. Like, I have to bring this in as part of Ken Wilber's legacy, the sort of gateway perhaps into some, the awareness of him on some sort of pop level. And the film is not pop, as you expressed, right? It's hard to watch in some ways, but it's spectacular. It's super romantic and seductive, and it's gorgeous. But it triggers people. It chose me, that I just surrendered to it. And I said, I've got to be the one to tell this story. And it's really a story about transcendence. It's really a story about that, Marianne Williamson talks about the book and the movie of, that it's about the way love transforms us. Yeah. And Deepak Chopra gave a beautiful response to the movie, saying that, there's this thin veil between, sort of total devastation and complete liberation, and that the movie articulates that in a very clear way. And I think I'll make one comparison to sort of ground that, is that, like, Titanic is not about the sinking of a ship. There's a lot of ship sinking going on in that movie, right? But it's really that the sinking of the ship allows these two people to know that, wow, I'm in love with this other person. I'm impassioned with this other person. And we don't work together in the normal world, but because we're confronted with our own mortality, my God, we're going to go for it. And they go for it, right? And we all want to live like that. That's what romance is. And so in the same way, Grace and Grit is a story. Boy meets girl. Girl gets ill with cancer. They stay in love. And then something else happens. It gets worse, tears them apart. They get back together. She dies at the end, right? But it's not really about cancer, right? It's about transcendence. It's about love beyond life. It's about what are the vehicles in our own lives that allow us to be transformed, that might at some viewpoint to us seem daunting, like something we don't want to enter, but are ultimately the things that are the vehicles for our own becoming and our own deep sense of belonging, that are the requisites to these ingredients of our own beauty. And Ken Wilber wrote so many books before he met Treya. And then when they were together, and the movie takes place between 85 and 91 in Northern California. And then after she passed, he wrote 3 books that rocked the world of spirituality and psychology and philosophy, right? He wrote Grace and Grit, and he wrote The Sex Ecology and Spirituality. And he wrote A Brief History of Everything. And those books are spectacular, right? Spectacular. So I think that when I had the opportunity, after I had known him and become close with him in some way, that I felt like this is a big thing to take on, to carry this torch. But if there's one mind that's alive today that I'm indebted to, it's his. The least I can do as a film director, as a filmmaker, as a storyteller, is articulate this onto the screen for others.
Wow. Thank you for the context, Sebastian. I want to actually kind of talk a little bit about the love story between Ken and Trey. Is it Treya or Trey?
Treya.
Treya. Okay. I think, what spoke to me in that journey, I think, like you said, it's just the vehicles that we have for transcendence and transformation come in so many different forms. And this, to me, just felt so profoundly deep. The connection that they had, I think, if I could recall, like the lines from the film, that they felt something just by first touch, right? Like there was just this beautiful connection, and that's rare, right? I think a lot of people don't necessarily have those moments, or at least are not open enough to have those types of connections. I also think, for me, what moved me was the journey of the illness, the ups and the downs, the process of feeling like there's going to be some kind of light at the end of the tunnel, and then that tunnel closing down into darkness. And I also was moved by Ken's commitment to the partnership, because I think that what I've noticed about people in general is that their level of commitment actually is something that you can see in their work itself. So clearly, like, whatever he takes on, it seems like he's incredibly committed to it, even if it's like breaking him apart, and so, yeah, I want to just, highlight those moments and what they maybe meant to you, or what it felt like to actually write the dialogue and the narrative for that.
Thank you for what you said there about, and I think that is indicative of Ken Wilber, that he's trying, that he's touching the edges of sort of consciousness evolution in his work as a writer. And And I think that's one of the reasons we were simpatico, and I think that's probably why he trusted me. One of the reasons why he trusted me to take this story to screen. And he never had questions for me once he made the decision that he trusts me. He didn't need to see the script. He didn't need to see anything. And then he loved the film, and he gave a very beautiful review of it. And there's a discussion with me and him and Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson online. It's available. It's linked at my site. And there's another discussion with Ken and myself and Alex and Allyson Grey as well about the movie, about transcendence, about love as a vehicle, about myth and storytelling. But I think that in the same way that if I commit to something, I'm very tentative. I move very slowly in all things in my life, right? I'm slow the way I choose a book, where I choose to make a home, who I choose to be in a relationship with, right? I'm not a dater. I've never been, I'm not, as a boy, I was not promiscuous. I'm not, and none of these things are moral issues. It's just that I'm seeking depth beyond span. That what's exciting to me, right? In other words, that, authenticity, right, is the new taboo, right? Who wants to go deep and how deep, right? And so it requires a certain amount of endurance to go deep. Like everybody can hold their breath and go underwater 10 feet, right? But who's hanging out at 30 feet? Who's at 100 feet? And who's at 300 feet? And it starts to feel different down there. It starts to yield different rewards. The silence is a different type of silence. The color is a different type of color. And we start to take on different qualities inside of us. The terrain starts to change, right? A sort of synesthetic dynamic occurs, right? Where we can see sound, hear color, if you will. In other words, as we transform, the whole terrain, right, is holographic and becomes dynamic. And I think that commitment to say, well, I'm going to go, it doesn't matter if this thing breaks me, immediately makes it so that it does not break us, right? And that's the story, really, of the hero, right? The hero is someone who takes the chaos in life and creates order out of it by transmuting the energy into some sort of productivity, right? And I think that that's the excitement that dovetails back in the beginning of our conversation of uncovering the shadow. And so then therefore in this relationship with this man and this woman, and as you said, Ken's dedication to this woman is not just a dedication to Treya, right? To the love of his life, right? To this romantic draw together, to this energy of Eros, right? But it is also the dedication to the great mother, to the great woman, right? To love itself. In other words, in the Martin Buber way, this I-thou relationship, that he's not just loving her by loving her. He's loving the great mother. He's loving the source of life and creativity itself, right? All women he's celebrating. All of life he's celebrating. He's celebrating that inside of himself. And so then therefore, no wonder he wrote 3 such spectacular books after her, right? Because her voice is then inside of him. And I think in the articulation of that film onto screen, I knew I was the one to tell the story because I knew that was what was at the crux of the story, right? It's the plot did not matter so much. Although when you watch that movie, everything in there is true. Every person is true, every character. And you see in the end, there's live footage that we recreated and there's, you can see the actors next to the actual people, etc. But it's the theme of transcendence, that it's, the theme of touching love in our daily lives and how we touch love beyond our daily life. We touch love outside of the stream of time when we consistently touch it, in mundane and regular ways is how we create a deep spiritual life, right?
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Sebastian. Yeah, I honestly, I think a lot of what you're saying feels so important right now, especially in Western culture, where it feels like we don't actually want to spend time in vulnerability and deep intimacy, and everything is short characters. Like social media exchanges feel very empty. I feel like intimacy has multiple levels. Sometimes say like there's like 7 or 8 levels of intimacy or more. And, I think Robert Otto actually said, people can only meet you at the level of intimacy that they have with themselves. And so I love the exchange in that relationship because it's rare when 2 people can meet at a very deep level of intimacy and are willing to go there, because it does take so much. I mean, there's so much exposure, right? There's so much of self that comes up. And I think, I've talked to a lot of different relationship experts on this, that avoidance comes up as because people are so triggered by their own, maybe the weaknesses that come up that are exposed in a relationship, from another, and would rather numb out or leave or depart. But that's like where the juice is, that's kind of where the transformation happens. And I think a lot of people shortchange themselves by leaving too early or projecting something onto someone when everyone's really just a mirror to yourself. So yeah, so I wanted to just highlight that because I was very moved by that relationship.
Thank you. As my own practice, I think I look towards things that I'm excited by, that I'm drawn to, but also that make me a little uncomfortable. Like I like to sign up for things that are beyond me, because we can only become more by signing up for things that we're not ready for yet. It's like, let's say becoming president of the United States. It's like no one's ready for that job. There's no course you take. You only become ready by doing the job, right? And so it's like that in anything, And so it's like, what lover are we going to choose, right? What friend are we going to choose? Are we going to choose the friend that just tells us we're great and is it easy to go, easy, be by all the time? And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not a moral issue. But it is to say, like, all right, if we're really going to cultivate like an amazing oak, right, then we've got to bury this seed deep, right? And we've got to water this, and we've got to put it in the place of sunshine. And you know what? It's going to hurt when some of these branches come out. But oh my God, the spectacle of these branches, like, who doesn't like Bach or Beethoven? Who doesn't like, looking up at the Sistine Chapel and looking at that, spectacular painting, right? Who doesn't like, an amazing love song that rips us apart and has us cry and celebrate, And even all the greatest comedians, you ask all the greatest comedians alive, who's the greatest? And they'll all tell you Richard Pryor, right? They'll all tell you Robin Williams, right? That at the core of that humor is this deep sense of pain, right? That in other words, what we're making fun of in life in joy is the very thing that hurts us, because it's kind of funny, it's kind of funny that we're so sensitive with our little lives that are like 20, 50, 100 years long. Like, who cares, like, let's have fun with the thing, yeah, it's going to be salty. Yeah, it's going to be a little uncomfortable. But once we get past that, wow, anything can happen. And the requisite for that is staying in it, right? Staying in it. And so, sure, a lot of women remark about how Ken's dedication and devotion to his wife is remarkable, because, sure, it's a reference point for what's possible in love, right? Two people will oftentimes see that movie, and I've had couples come in my office in Santa Monica, or online, and say, "Hey, we saw the movie, we got in a fight afterwards," and then the next day, like, we made love all day, and like we went on like a daycation or whatever. Then I say, okay, that's where the action's at, because of course, like, when you see something so spectacular, it's like we all want that. Well, all right, you want to slay that dragon, you got to be comfortable getting on that dragon, and this dragon's going to fly high, and it's scary if you fall off. But you don't get the view from up there if you don't make the jump, right? No jump, no story. And so in my own life, I think I was drawn to that. I was drawn to that story, to Grace and Grit, and to making that into a film, because I think I know that it's in my molecular makeup, that I felt comfortable right off the bat. I know what that story is. It's not a cancer story. Yes, many people around the world have called me and told me that they held their loved one when they died, and they've never seen anything depicted in such a real way. And so this movie is for them. Absolutely. And yet it is also for anyone who is not concerned with cancer. That sometimes people will say, "Oh, look, I had cancer, my friend or my mother or my lover or whatever, it's too close to home." I say, "Oh, no. The movie's for you." Like, the movie's for you. This is a sad movie. You're going to cry, right? But you'll be elated and uplifted at the end, because something is born out of that. In other words, no crucifixion, no resurrection. And my mission as a storyteller in psychology, as a writer of books, and as a facilitator of immersive meditative events, and as a director and writer of movies, is crucifixion, resurrection, but you got to stick to the crucifixion if you want to get to the resurrection.
Oh, yes. Amen. Honestly, because I think a lot of people just don't, right? And also they end up getting or seeing the reality based on what they're willing to put up with as well, right? There's a lot of folks like just really can't sit in their own with themselves, right? Like they don't actually know themselves well enough. And I say this with no judgment. It's just that I think a lot of people today don't really have a lot of time. So I think that's what one needs really, to be able to kind of sit with oneself and really ask oneself, these deeper questions. And very few people get that opportunity to do that, right? So Sebastian, since we're coming at time, I'd like to understand, like, why do you think that this subject is so important? It's telling the story about grace and grit, and also the themes that have been brought up from the beginning about courage, about mortality, sitting in the uncomfortableness. Why do you think these topics are so important for humanity right now?
The first movie I made was a documentary called Awakening World. It's a very short, simple film. It deals with 5 questions. What's the purpose of life? What's love? What's heaven? What's hell? What's intimacy? And it can be seen on my website with trailers and clips, etc. And when I took that film around to festivals, the Q&A would always go on beyond, because everybody wanted to discuss the film afterwards, and it would just always, they couldn't get people out of the theater because people wanted to engage so much. And then many people said, you got to take this to prisons, you got to take this to jails. And so I did. And the same thing happened there. And I created this curriculum for kids in juvenile detention, and the same thing, that the value of it was the asking of the questions, right? What's love? What's the purpose of life? What's heaven? What's hell? What's intimacy? And when I say heaven and hell, I mean, like, what's the worst we can create here, and what's the best we can create here together between us? And so this film, this story, this book, Grace and Grit, is important in the same way that so many love stories or love songs or poems or artworks about love are important, because there's no finality, right? Love exists before us and after us and beyond us. It's a stream, an energy, and a current that we fall into. And Khalil Gibran writes about it so much, right? That it's not that love is in me, it's that I am in the heart of God, that I am in the heart of love, right? That I awaken to it, that I open my eyes, right? And when your heart's on fire, every face is beautiful, right? All eyes are spectacular. Yeah. And I feel that way, and I live that way. Yeah, I operate that way, no matter who I'm in contact with on a day-to-day level. I demand that of myself. And so I felt that this story in this book, and so then therefore this movie, I wanted to articulate the reference point for what's possible in love. And these are 2 human beings that we see them at their best and we see them at their worst, right? That they showed their vulnerabilities. And the film adapted from the book, which chronicles their journals, is transparent. And so to say, well, wow, these are 2 really evolved human beings, and look at them when they falter, and then look how glorious they are. And they're only able to be so glorious because they falter so fully. They commit so deeply to their faltering. And so then therefore they can rise so high. Yeah. And I said, wow, that's a reference point for what's possible in love. And if I'm alive here now, I don't know how many more instances I'm going to be alive, but I want to love like that. I want to be loved like that. I want to share like that. I want to become like that. I'm willing. Yeah, I'm willing to commit. I'm willing to go inward and onward, because everything else, and again, it's not a moral issue. It's just, I've done that, right? Like, I want to take it to the next level. And so then this movie is not important for everyone. But if people want to take it to the next level of life, of transcendence, of meaning, of fulfillment, of love, then this story is a potent one.
Sebastian, thank you so much. So what sort of things have surprised you the most after completing this film and looking back on your journey of making it?
That's a good question. I don't know if I get surprised. I mean, I gave myself fully, right? And making the film almost killed me, on every level. I mean, if anything, it's content that I'm comfortable with, and it's content that I appreciate and that I am devoted to, right? When I talk about transcendence and love and deep romance and becoming. And I'm surprised, I suppose, because of my vantage point, that more people aren't interested in that. And yet I'm also not surprised, but pleasantly, that so many brilliant people around the world have lauded the film. Yeah. That when the film came out, there was like 3 really scathing reviews. Yeah. And one woman who wrote for the New York Times, and nothing against her, but she just destroyed the film, was like, this is the worst film that was ever made, And then when I read the review, I didn't care. I was just like, wow, I wonder why she was so triggered. And then I look at the movie and it's 98%, right, on Amazon. And people were very defensive about it because they felt like, has this woman ever held someone who died in their arms? How can she mock the film so aggressively? Yeah. And then someone else wrote me from the same paper and said, look, I'm sorry, this person reviewed your film. It's beautiful. So I suppose I was just in some way, and people have said that this movie is 10 years ahead of its time. And that's fine. It may be. And Chongyam Trungpa writes a lot about that great art is always going to be misunderstood when it comes out, And I'm not saying that I'm a great artist, but I know that I collaborated with some brilliant artists, that these actors are extraordinary. Yeah. And that many people, and you can see out there, all the people who've talked about it, they've really done something amazing in this movie. Right. And Julia Ormond and I talk about it in a interview online. Light is a main character in this movie, and sound is a main character. And Kim and Catherine Kluge, who used to run the San Francisco Symphony, did the sound and did the score rather. And their first movie was Scorsese's Silence, and they've only done a few movies, and they work with only major directors. And they did this movie. I couldn't afford them, right? But they did it because they love the content so much, right? They came over to my editor's house and they watched kind of 40 minutes of my first rough assembly, and they said, this is such an important story, and it's going to live beyond us all. When we're all dead, people are still going to be watching this movie. We want to do it, and you just whatever you want to pay us, we'll work it out. We want to be part of this. And I think that all the actors, whether it was Meryl Hemingway or Francis Fisher and Mina Suvari and Stuart Townsend, they all did it for the same reason. I did it for the same reason. Yeah, that I am loyal to something that's beyond me. And so I suppose if you say, what am I surprised by? I guess in some way I'm always surprised that in the same way that you said, people don't want to go deep or stay disciplined or stay in there with something that's important to them. I guess I'm always surprised it's, that people aren't more responsive, because this movie is largely undiscovered in America. My only request would be that if you watch it and you live in America, that you leave a review on Amazon, right, or on Apple and Rotten Tomatoes. It's ironic, though, because in the Latin cultures, in Latin America, it's now one of the top 5 or 10 most watched movies in all Latin America on Netflix, right? Yeah, and so it's why is it caught on there and not caught on here yet? And there was no promotion down there. But because perhaps that's a more romantic culture. Mm-hmm. And I think that the same thing is going to happen in the Middle East and in Saudi and these other countries, because these countries are so old, right? America is only, 250 years old. These Latin cultures, we're going back hundreds, couple thousand years, right? Some of these lands where people say, there's something going on that's beyond me. And I'm interested in this story. I'm interested in the story of Muhammad, of Christ, of Buddha. I'm interested in the love that echoes on, right? And my hope is that more people will become interested in that. And I think I made this movie at just the right time, because people are now starting to discover it here. I'm getting more and more messages online, from in different languages. Thanks to the language of emoji, I can understand what people are trying to say. It looks something like book emoji, movie emoji, heart emoji, tear emoji, heart, right? But it's humbling, and it lets me know too, in some sort of synchronistic way, that I'm on course. That the sacrifice and the dedication and the devotion is worthwhile. And so the surprise, I suppose, comes with some sort of satisfaction then afterwards also, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I'm just in awe of anyone completing their movie, because I know I've made a short film, which was a fantasy drama that almost completely gutted me too. So I just think anyone who's able to make a movie and also finish it in itself is just such a huge accomplishment, just because there's so many layers of complexity to finish a film, right? And as you're aware of. So yeah, I think I think what you said about the movie being ahead of its time feels very spot on, right? And because I think also when I first sat down to watch it, I really thought it was going to be a very different type of film. And then, so I think it's sort of something that has to be appreciated with the right minds, with sort of like the right mindset, and also with the right openness to kind of this new worldview of romance and love and transcendence and the desire to go deep and the desire to really shift. So yeah, so I think that I think it's going to do exceptionally well, and will probably be a masterpiece for a long time. That was my reaction when I saw it. I thought it was a masterpiece. So
thank you so much for that. The collaboration with these other artists, we make this film together, is a very intimate collaboration. Yeah, for the artist to trust the director, completely, so that the symphony can play freely. Yeah, and so that then the notes of the instruments pick up in one another, across the symphony, is the art of directing. And, I'm in production now on, 3 other movies, right, that I'm directing, that I'm producing, some that I'm co-writing, others that I'm not. And certainly Grace and Grit has facilitated, these other films. One of them, the soonest upcoming one, is called 180, which is also an inspiring story. It's a broader pop film, but a story about sticking in there, and allowing the miracle to happen. And I think that, one of the things when this film came out, if nothing else, that the most tender, brilliant directors that I know, right, who are alive today making mega movies, called me, when the movie came out, and said, like, oh my God, like you did it, like you just did something that they don't make. And the most common thing I heard from my peers, other producers and directors, was they don't make movies like this anymore, right? They don't make movies like this anymore. And so that's what I set out to do, I think, with that one, in service to the book, in service to love.
Amazing. Sebastian, thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate your time. Are there any resources that you can point folks to in order to learn more about you and your work? Where can we watch Grace and Grit, and also where can we follow you?
Grace and Grit is in America and Canada on Apple, Amazon, Showtime, Hulu. Internationally, it's usually on Netflix. There's a website, graceandgrit.net, though, that has a number of different logos. Those logos are all hyperlinks to different outlets from, all sorts of major outlets around the world, interviews and discussions around the film, etc. Myself, I don't use a lot of social media, but I do use Instagram lightly. Sebastian Siegel, Siegel, with a digit 1 after it. And I respond to pretty much everything on there at some juncture. And then for psychology, my website, deeplyconscious.com. Deeplyconscious.com is also another source of. And I'm starting to use Twitter from time to time, just my name, Sebastian Siegel, as well. But if anyone sees the film, and if anyone is interested in psychology and the resurrection that happens after the crucifixion, then please contact me. Absolutely.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Sebastian. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about so many things, Grace and Grit, how our unconscious and conscious thoughts really impact our lives, and so much more. And you can tune into Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.